I have spent the last 11 months telling you exactly where this was heading. I told you in January that the Red Sea would not reopen on Washington's timeline. I told you in March that the Israeli campaign against Iran's nuclear program would end not in victory, but in a quiet American climb down. I told you in May, when the B-2S went in and the headlines screamed that Fordo had been erased, that within 90 days the United States would be looking for an off-ramp, and that the off-ramp would not look like an off-ramp. It would look like a pause. It would look like restraint. It would look like wisdom. Every one of those calls is now on public record. You can go back and check the timestamps. Today I am going to make one more prediction, and this one is different, because this one is not about what Iran will do, or what Israel will do. It is about what has already happened inside the American system that almost nobody in the Western press has the language to describe. The bombing stopped, and the reason it stopped is not the reason you are being told. I am Professor Jen Shaking. On this channel, we do not do panic and we do not do cheerleading. We follow the logic of power. We follow the incentives. We follow the geography. We follow the money. I will be honest with you. What the logic is telling me right now is the most uncomfortable conclusion I have reached in 3 years of doing this work. The United States did not stop bombing Iran because it won. The United States did not stop bombing Iran because Iran capitulated. The United States stopped bombing Iran because for the first time since 1991, the American war machine looked at the board, ran the numbers, and discovered that it could not afford the war it had already started. That is the sentence I have been circling around for weeks, and I think it is time to say it directly. Washington did not choose restraint. Washington ran out of the physical, financial, and industrial capacity to continue, and the people inside the Pentagon and inside Central Command know it. That is what I am going to show you today. I am going to show you exactly which capacity ran out first, why the Gulf monarchies quietly pulled the plug, and why the consequences of this moment will define the next decade of American power in ways that make the fall of Kabul look like a footnote. Let me start with the structural picture because you need to see the whole board before I show you the trigger. In the 72 hours after the June strikes on Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan, the United States expended somewhere between 14 and 18% of its entire operational inventory of GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators. That is the 30,000-pound bunker buster. The one weapon in the American arsenal capable of reaching hardened deep-earth targets like Fordo. The total inventory, according to the numbers that leaked through congressional testimony in July, sits somewhere around 20 units. The B-2 fleet that delivers them numbers 19 aircraft, of which typically 11 are mission-capable at any given moment. Now hold those numbers in your head, because that is the entire American capability to strike deep-buried nuclear infrastructure anywhere on Earth, not just in Iran. Anywhere, including targets in North Korea and, in a future contingency, in China. Now layer on top of that the Tomahawk expenditure. In the same window, the U.S. Navy fired approximately 125 Tomahawk cruise missiles. The production line at Raytheon in Tucson currently produces around 70 Tomahawks per year. Do the arithmetic. In 3 days, the United States expended 21 months of production. THAAD interceptors used to defend Al Udeid and Al Dhafra during the Iranian retaliation were consumed at a rate that Lockheed's Troy, Alabama facility cannot replace inside of 4 years at current throughput. Patriot PAC-3 MSE interceptors, the ones that actually stop ballistic missiles, are being simultaneously drained into Ukraine, into Israel, into Saudi Arabia, and into Taiwan pre-positioning. The Pentagon's own internal assessment, which was reported in fragmentary form by Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal in late July, concluded that the United States is now below what the war planners call the Pacific Reserve threshold. That is the minimum stockpile required to fight a 7-day defensive engagement over Taiwan. We crossed below it in June, we are still below it today, and every additional day of Iran operations pushed us further below it. That is the structural picture. The bombing did not stop because Iran was defeated. The bombing stopped because the magazine was empty. Now let me name what I am describing because it deserves a proper name. What we are watching is what I am going to call the empty magazine constraint. It is not a doctrine, it is not a strategy. It is a physical, industrial, mathematical ceiling on American power projection that has been building for 25 years and that arrived in the summer of 2025 with the force of a wall. The empty magazine constraint means that the United States, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, must now choose between theaters. It cannot fight Iran and simultaneously credibly deter China. It cannot resupply Ukraine and simultaneously replenish Israel and simultaneously maintain Pacific reserves. The illusion of infinite American firepower, an illusion that has structured every foreign policy decision from Belgrade to Baghdad to Tripoli, is over. And Tehran, Beijing, Moscow, and Pyongyang all figured this out at approximately the same moment in late June. Now let me walk you through the cascade, because the sequence matters. First, the June 11th through June 24th window. Israel opens the campaign, expecting a short war. The United States is drawn in progressively, first with defensive THAAD and Patriot support, then with offensive B-2 strikes on the 22nd. Iran retaliates against Al-Udeid on the 23rd. The retaliation is telegraphed, symbolic, and largely intercepted, but the interception itself consumes a staggering quantity of high-end air defense munitions. Second, in the 72 hours following, Central Command submits a classified expenditure report up the chain to the Joint Staff. That report, according to reporting in Defense One, and confirmed by 2 former officials I have spoken with, contains a single line that stops the war. The line reads, in effect, that continued operations at current tempo will exhaust theater air defense inventory within 11 days and Pacific Reserve inventory within 19. Third, the chairman briefs the president. The president, whose entire political brand is built on ending wars rather than starting them, is given a choice framed not as diplomatic, but as arithmetic. Continue and be the president who left Taiwan undefended, or stop and declare victory. Fourth, the Gulf monarchies, who have their own real-time visibility into American munitions, flows through their own defense contracts, quietly signal to Washington through the Emirati and Qatari channels that they will not host further offensive operations. They have looked at the same numbers. They understand that if the Americans run dry, the Iranian counter-response will fall on Abu Dhabi and Doha, not on Washington. Fifth, and this is the step almost nobody has reported, the Chinese make a private communication through the Swiss channel, indicating that any further escalation will be met with an acceleration of specific economic countermeasures involving rare earth export licensing that the Commerce Department had spent the previous 6 months trying to unwind. The cascade closes. The ceasefire is announced on June 24th. It is described in the American press as a triumph of presidential deal-making. It is in fact a triumph of inventory management. Now let me take each actor and explain the deeper calculation, because the mainstream framing on every one of them is wrong. Take Washington first. The mainstream frames the ceasefire as strategic patience, as a president who knows when to walk away. That framing misses the deeper calculation. The deeper calculation is that the American defense industrial base, which was optimized in the 1990s for a peer conflict that never came and then re-optimized in the 2000s for counterinsurgency, is not currently capable of fighting the kind of high-intensity, missile-heavy, air defense-intensive war that a real Iran campaign requires. The Pentagon has known this since the 2018 National Defense Strategy. Congress has been told repeatedly, nothing has been done at the scale required, because the scale required is on the order of $200 billion of sustained munitions investment over 10 years. And that money keeps getting redirected into platforms, into carriers and F-35S and Sentinel ICBMs, rather than into the boring, unglamorous, absolutely decisive question of how many missiles are in the shed. Now take Tehran. The mainstream frames Iran as a wounded, cornered animal. That framing misses the deeper calculation. Iran did not need to win the June war. Iran needed to survive the June war with its retaliatory credibility intact and its nuclear knowledge base preserved. It achieved both. The centrifuges at Fordo were damaged, but the scientists were not, the designs were not, the enrichment know-how was not. And every hour that the ceasefire holds is an hour Iran uses to disperse, harden, and reconstitute. Now take Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. The mainstream frames the Gulf monarchies as reluctant American partners, quietly grateful for U.S. protection. That framing missed the deeper calculation by about 3 years. The Saudis and the Emiratis have been hedging systematically toward Beijing since 2022, and the June war confirmed for them what they already suspected. The American security umbrella is a rhetorical commodity, not a physical guarantee. You cannot defend Abu Dhabi with a press release. You defend it with interceptors, and the interceptors are running out. Take Beijing. The mainstream frames China as an opportunistic observer. That framing misses the deeper calculation. China is not observing. China is stress testing. Every day of the Iran war was a live-fire intelligence collection operation on American munitions consumption rates, American logistics timelines, American command and control latency, and American political tolerance for casualties among allies. Beijing now possesses the most detailed real-world dataset on American high-intensity warfighting capacity since Desert Storm. And unlike Desert Storm, this dataset points in the opposite direction. And take Moscow. The mainstream frames Russia as a spectator too bogged down in Ukraine to matter. That framing misses the deeper calculation. Russia sold Iran the S-400 components and the electronic warfare kit that shaped how the Israeli air campaign actually performed. And Russia is watching American munitions flow to Israel that would otherwise flow to Kyiv. Every tomahawk fired at Iran is a tomahawk not fired at or not deterring Russian operations in Donetsk. The Iran war was, from Moscow's perspective, a strategic gift. Now before I go further, I want to present the strongest counter-argument, because I owe you the real debate. Here is the steelman, a serious analyst, someone from the American Enterprise Institute, or from RAND, would push back on everything I have just said in the following way. They would argue that the munitions expenditure figures I have cited are exaggerated, that the classified inventory is substantially larger than the leaked numbers suggest, that the production lines have surge capacity that has not been publicly disclosed, and that the ceasefire reflects not exhaustion, but successful coercion. Iran, they would say, was brought to heel. The strikes achieved their political purpose, which was to establish a demonstrable red line on nuclear weaponization, and to signal to Beijing that the United States can and will act decisively when it chooses to. On this reading, my empty magazine thesis mistakes prudence for weakness. It confuses the deliberate husbanding of scarce high-end munitions, which is a rational feature of any well-run military, with the exhaustion of them. They would further argue that the Gulf monarchies did not pull the plug. They were consulted, they concurred, and they continue to host American forces at pre-war levels. And on China, they would argue that the intelligence flow ran the other direction. Beijing saw an American president willing to strike Fordow, a target the Chinese had privately assessed for years as functionally unstrikable, and updated its Taiwan calculus toward greater caution, not less. That is the steelman. It is a serious argument, and I want you to hear it in its strongest form before I tell you why I do not find it persuasive. I do not find it persuasive for 3 reasons, and I will give them to you directly because you deserve to see exactly how I got here. The first reason is that the surge capacity argument does not survive contact with the actual production data. Raytheon and Lockheed have both testified publicly before the House Armed Services Committee within the last 18 months that surge production of Tomahawks, THAAD interceptors, and PAC-3 MSEs is bounded not by orders but by supply chain bottlenecks in specific components. Solid rocket motors from a single facility in Arkansas. Seeker heads from a supplier base that shrank by 60% between 2000 and 2020. Specialty energetics that require environmental permits that take 3 to 5 years to obtain. You cannot surge past a chemistry problem. The classified inventory being larger than the leaks suggest, even if true, does not change the replenishment curve, and it is the replenishment curve, not the current stockpile, that determines whether you can sustain a campaign. The second reason is that the coercion argument fails on the observable Iranian behavior. Iran has not slowed its nuclear program since June. It has accelerated dispersal, accelerated enrichment at previously undisclosed sites, and, according to the IAEA's September report, has moved a substantial quantity of 60% enriched material to locations the inspectors can no longer access. This is not the behavior of a coerced state. This is the behavior of a state that concluded, correctly, that the next round will be fought on more favorable terms because the American magazine will be even emptier. The third reason is the Gulf posture. I have been told by people whose judgment I trust that the operational tempo of American aircraft at Al Udeid and Al Dhafra has declined by roughly 40% since July, and that specific mission sets, particularly those involving deep strike planning against Iranian targets, have been quietly moved to Diego Garcia. That is not consultation and concurrence. That is a host nation asking the guest to please practice his golf swing somewhere else. So where does this leave us? It leaves us in a world where the central assumption of the post-Cold War order, the assumption that American military power is functionally infinite and can be applied anywhere at any time at acceptable cost, has been quietly falsified. It was falsified not by a battlefield defeat which would be legible and correctable, but by an inventory report which is neither. Battlefield defeats produce reform. Inventory reports produce denial, because the people responsible for the inventory are the same people who must now explain why the inventory is what it is. And so the explanation that is being offered to the American public is that the president chose peace. The explanation that will be offered inside the Pentagon over the coming 18 months, in a series of increasingly urgent classified memos, is that the United States must now make a choice it has not had to make in a generation. It must choose which theater it can actually defend. And the arithmetic of that choice, once you work it through, does not favor the Persian Gulf. It does not favor Eastern Europe. It favors, and only barely favors, the first island chain in the Western Pacific, because that is the one theater where losing is not survivable for the American-led order. Everything else becomes, in the language of the internal planning documents, an economy of force theater. That is a bureaucratic phrase. In plain English, it means the theater where you accept that you cannot win, and you plan accordingly. What does this mean concretely for the next 12 to 24 months? It means that Iran's nuclear program is now, for practical purposes, unstoppable by military means, because the military means have been consumed and cannot be replenished on the timeline the program is advancing. It means that Israel, which understands this arithmetic better than anyone, will be forced into a decision it has been postponing since 2010. which is whether to act alone with the diminished tools it possesses or to accept a nuclear Iran and reorient its entire strategic posture around deterrence rather than prevention. It means that the Gulf monarchies will accelerate their hedging toward Beijing, not out of ideological affinity, but out of a cold assessment that the American umbrella has holes in it that cannot be patched inside their planning horizon. It means that Taiwan's window of security, which was already narrowing, has narrowed further, because every munition consumed over Iran is a munition not available over the Taiwan Strait, and Beijing knows the exact size of the remaining reserve to within a margin that would surprise you. And it means, and this is the hardest thing to say, that the American political system is about to be told a truth it is structurally incapable of processing, which is that the country has been spending 5% of its economy on defense for a generation, and has ended up with a military that cannot sustain a 2-week campaign against a mid-sized regional power without depleting reserves needed for the actual peer conflict. That truth will produce, I predict, not reform but blame. It will produce a search for scapegoats, a rotation of secretaries of defense, a series of congressional hearings that will accomplish nothing, and a doubling down on precisely the wrong investments, because the political economy of the American defense budget rewards platforms and punishes munitions, and no election cycle is long enough to reverse that. I want to close with something personal, because I have been doing this work long enough to know when a moment is a hinge and when it is just noise. This is a hinge. The stopping of the bombing in June was not a de-escalation, it was a revelation. It revealed, to anyone paying attention, that the physical foundations of American primacy have eroded to a point that the primacy itself is now a bluff being sustained by the willingness of adversaries not to call it. Iran called part of it and discovered how thin the walls were. China is watching and taking notes. Russia is watching and drawing conclusions. The Gulf monarchies are watching and quietly rearranging their portfolios. The only people who do not seem to be watching are the ones who most need to, which is the American electorate and the American Congress, because both are being told a story about strength, while the underlying reality tells a story about depletion. I have told you many times on this channel that the world does not end in a bang. It ends in a supply chain. It ends in a spreadsheet. It ends in a memo that says we are 11 days from empty, and a president who has to decide whether to tell the country. In June, that memo was written. That decision was made, and you and I are now living in the world that decision produced. I will keep following the logic wherever it takes us. I owe you that, and I intend to keep paying what I owe. Until next time, this is Professor Jen Shaching. Keep your eyes on the shed, not on the speeches. That is where the future is being written.